Thanks for joining us to take part in the 2014 Big Read, Missoula's month-long celebration of Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. Tonight, Gary Cook will be reading to us. He spent time in Vietnam as a Marine, and following his commitment, he remained in the area while the war continued in Laos, Cambodia, and northern Thailand. Gary has a very interesting background and will share some of his past experiences and a little about his book, Lone Walker, and insight into how he develops plot and character. He also has some books on the back table back there, so please check those out as well. Gary J. Cook is a somewhat reclusive writer who lives in the middle of an Indian reservation in Montana. He is a U.S. Marine combat veteran and a former sheriff's deputy with years of experience working undercover. He worked several years for a Chinese import-export company in Taipei and was a tenured professor at the Japanese university. He has been shot, stabbed, run over by his own motorcycle, severely chastised by a band of irate motorcycle chicks, and brought down by enemy fire more than a few times in helicopters. No one is more surprised than he that he is still around. As far as he is concerned, the fact that he also has a talent for writing is proof positive that the universe has a bent sense of humor. Thank you.
Well, for those of you that don't know me, and I think most of the people here do know me, some of you all too well. I'm a Missoula native. I'm 6th or 7th generation Montanan on my mother's side. That's if you don't count the Indian blood. My great-grandfather was part Blackfeet. My great-grandmother was part Cree. So I'm really a Montanan. Even though I've lived a little more than 20 years in Asia. In Asia, people always called me Mr. Montana. People would ask me where I was from, and I'd say, well, I'm from Montana. They'd say, well, where's Montana? And I'd say, well, Montana is a little-known country located between the United States and Canada. And in fact, that's kind of true if you've been around the world very much. So, this book, Lone Walker, is kind of the first book in what I intend to be a series, but it's not a series that's tied to the characters in this book. The series is a generational series. So this book is really basically the Vietnam War era. The next book, which is unfortunately called A Murder of Wolves, is about Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's connected in a generational way. The main protagonist in this book, Ben Tales, is the uncle of one of the main protagonists in A Murder of Wolves, who is half Blackfeet, Joe Big Snake Person. I say the unfortunate title of Murder of Wolves because when I titled the book, I forgot all about wolves being such a big deal politically in Montana. So people look at the cover and they see a guy leaning out the window with an M16 shooting at something. And I think they assume they're running up and down the road shooting at wolves. There are no wolves in that book. The wolves refer to the characters. It's a play on A Murder of Crows. That's all it is. In both books, what I'm most interested in is sort of the idea of warriors. These days, a warrior can be anything from a football player to a baker. It doesn't matter. It's such a misused word, but there is really no other word for me to use because the people in these books are warriors, and the root word is war. Warrior comes from the word war, and these people are good at waging war, but in a way that is unique to what we've come to call warriors. So I thought, well, geez, how can I do this without sounding like these guys are part of a football team? So I sort of tried to define what I thought a warrior is. And number one is a warrior has to have the will and want to defend others, to put others ahead of himself or herself. Along with this comes an intimate knowledge of death and destruction. Warriors are about strife. They're about using strife to solve problems. It's part of the human condition. It's not going to go away. Warriors always have a strong code of honor, a strong sense of integrity. Their moral compasses are grounded in reality and not in politics or religion or anything like that. They know how to function in a world without law, which is war. The problem with the warrior Ben Tales is the main protagonist in this book, is that trying to be a warrior, trying to retain a code of honor, to have integrity, and to do this all in a war that is manifestly the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time is a really difficult thing to do. So it gets back to what the warrior does. The warrior protects his own. He puts himself ahead of his own. In this case, Ben is a Marine, and he's devoted his life to protecting Marines and to protecting anybody else that needs protecting. It's a very complicated book. When I built Ben, it was with the idea that he would be representative of the people who fought in Vietnam. In today's wars, most of our fighting is done by special forces soldiers. By special forces, I mean Marine Recon, SEALs, Special Forces, Delta Force, and so on. Most of the actual fighting takes place using these sorts of troops. So Ben is sort of the prototype for that kind of warfare. He's a Marine sniper, and he's pretty much the best of the best when it comes to that. So this reading is supposed to be about Vietnam, before, during, and after, but in this book I really don't have a scene devoted just to Vietnam. Vietnam is a thread that goes through the entire book. The book starts in Cambodia in 1973, and it ends in Montana in 1993. Half of the book is set in Montana, half of it is set in Asia. A lot of it is set in Japan. But yet, Vietnam is a thread that goes through everything. Vietnam affected the whole world when it was going on. In my opinion, as an historian, I feel there are three periods in American history when this country mutated into something new and different. The first period, of course, was the Revolutionary War. That made America what the Founding Fathers wanted America to be. And then the Civil War, which totally changed what the Founding Fathers had set out to do. The states became subservient to the country itself. The federal government became stronger than any one state, that sort of thing. And of course there were the issues of slavery and so on. The third most important period in our history, I think, was the Vietnam War period. And I count that from just before World War II to almost to the present day. Totally changed our society, but not only our society, but world society. The way we look at things changed radically. Along with it, there was the feminist movement, there was all sorts of movements in this country that coincided with the Vietnam War, but yet I think the Vietnam War was the catalyst for most of that. So throughout this book, Vietnam is a thread, an important thread. When I write, I try to write a tapestry. I don't try to write in a linear fashion. In real life, I don't think we're ever totally in the present. We're always part of what we want to be and always part of what we were. Our memories always intrude on what we're doing all the time. You don't have to have flashbacks for that to happen. It's just the way that human beings function. So I try to do that in the book too. So Ben remembers a lot of things. He has some flashbacks, and the flashbacks become actual occurrences. But as I said, what happens to Ben is for me a metaphor for what happened to America in Vietnam. Ben is as American as I can possibly make him. He's part German, he's part French, he's part Blackfeet, he's part Cree. He's from Montana. And I think Montana, to many people in the world, Montana is the archetype of what Americans and America is really supposed to be. Many of our myths about the American West happened in Montana. Everything from Robbers Roost to Custer to the mines in Butte. I mean, we can go on and on and on. A lot happened in Montana that most people who don't live in Montana don't realize it all happened in Montana. They think maybe it happened in Texas or Wyoming or somewhere else. Plus, there's the country of Montana. Montana itself is always a major character in all my writing. How could it not be? If you've grown up in Montana, you understand the power of this place. If you've grown up in this place and then left, as I did, for quite a while, every time you come back, you realize just how much impact the country itself really has on who you are. That impact, I think, is universal. We brought a lot of Japanese students to Montana, and one thing, the great equalizer, was Montana itself. The wilderness area, the mountains, the sky, rivers, the people. It's something universal about Montana that everybody seems to fit. And it breaks down barriers. So for those reasons, I chose Montana as a place to have been from. Also, Montana is traditionally, since the Civil War, a refuge for combat veterans from all of our wars. We have more combat veterans per capita in Montana than any other state in the Union. And we know that without even knowing, really having an accurate idea of the true number of veterans who live here. So, I guess the only way to do this is to first introduce you to Ben Tales. And since it is a thread, I'm not going to talk about the plot of the book or any of that. It's just too complicated. This is the one thread that's about a warrior who fought in Vietnam and his life. And so I'm going to skip around in this book quite a bit. I'm starting at the back, as you can see, and we'll work forward. Oops, I'm not going to start that far back. This book won an award for best first book from a small publisher. And that award was not just for the writing, it was for the production values and so on, the cover, everything. And one thing that the publisher did is, if the section is in Asia, he used bamboo. If it's set in Montana, he used pines. It's kind of neat. So this has been just back in Montana. The mountain stood proud and aloof, in his mind like women long neglected, suspicious of any sudden affection. Their creases and cliffs above the tree line dusted with the first snow of the season. Peaks etched against a sky so blue it didn't look real. The larch had turned yellow, easy to see against the greens of Douglas fir and ponderosa pine. As the old International rattled and bounced down the severely washboarded gravel road, he rolled down the window, letting in air crisp with the smell of river and pine, and from somewhere, the smell of apples. Always when he came back, it was as if he had never left. Only the accusing, suspicious presence of the mountains and a scattering of new, very large custom log homes to remind him that it had been years, not days, since he had last driven this road. He slowed to watch a group of white-tailed does and fawns feeding at the edge of a crop grain field white with frost. No bucks. The bucks would be nocturnal until rutting season. He'd have to dig out the 308 and shoot himself an elk this year. He'd grown up on venison and elk and he missed it. An image of his grandfather slid into his mind. His grandfather standing in his ratty old long johns, an even older pair of his grandmother's fuzzy slippers barely covering the front half of his feet, cooking eggs and elk sausage on the ancient wood stove. He could almost smell the eggs and sausage cooking. Grizzled, unshaven grandpa, a big, burly, florid bear of a man who drank rarely and smoked never. A retired Montana Power linesman, a linesman back in the days when roads were few and often not passable in the winter. A hard man who should have been bitter but wasn't. Corny jokes and twinkling eyes. A piece of old hardwood flooring next to the stove to stir the fire and to whack his bottom. 2 pair of boxing gloves hanging from a nail in the woodshed when he was older. His grandmother had died from diphtheria when his father was a teen, and then his mother and father had died in a car accident when he was an infant. Looking back on it now, it explained a lot about his grandfather's attitudes and philosophies. Nothing more important than these mountains, he'd say. When you are in some God-forsaken corner of the world, feeling low as beaver shit, you remember that. A piece of work, his grandfather, a fanatic about house and land and equipment. If he had the wood pile out of square, his grandfather would tear it down and make him restack it. Beds made, clothes folded. The ancient linoleum in the kitchen once a month stripped and re-waxed. God help anyone who wore shoes in the house. Damn, Manfred had said the first time he'd used the outhouse. You got the only shitter in the entire world that don't hardly stink. 3 fingers shot off at Bella Wood, another 2 lost and his innards forever messed up when someone had ignored the note at the power station and thrown the switch for a couple of seconds before realizing what he'd done. Grandpa had been up on that line. His grandfather would delight kids by pretending to stick one of his missing fingers all the way up his nose. He'd blink his eye and make it water, claiming he was tickling the back of his eye with his finger. He never talked about his war or about his son's war in the Pacific, but he taught him how to track and how to shoot and how to move in the forest. Once, when he was 11, he'd shot a chipmunk for no reason other than the chipmunk was noisy and telling the whole forest they were there. And his grandfather hadn't spoken to him for a week. At the end of the week, his grandfather had said, "You go spend a few nights up that mountain. No need to take a rifle or your knife. What you got on right now is plenty. No, don't say anything. You bring me a quartz rock from that old mine shaft so I know you went at least that far. Go on, get." Ben smiled. Up on the mountain, he'd taken off his jeans and tied the legs, and he'd filled his pant legs with rocks from all over the top of the mountain and hauled them home. Together they built a new sweat lodge in the big stand of aspen down where the creek emptied into the trout pond, using the rocks he brought back for the fire pit. Had themselves a fine sweat, the best sweat he'd ever had. The sweat had hid his young tears. He blinked to clear his vision. The truck had come to a stop in the middle of the road. He stepped on the gas and the truck chugged ahead. Tough as nails, his grandfather, thick as a tree trunk, not afraid to look ridiculous in his long johns and fuzzy slippers. He understood now that the old things his grandfather had been ferocious in defense of were part of his grandfather's memories. Manfred had been home on leave and had come out to see his grandfather and found him sitting in the swing on the front porch, his skin still warm to the touch. His grandfather's heart, scarred and weakened decades before by the jolt of electricity he'd taken up on that line, had finally given out. It had been an easy and perhaps a welcome death. He liked to think that his grandfather had known it was coming and had gone out on the porch to look at the mountains as he died. He squinted toward the snow-dusted peaks. When he'd come home on emergency leave for the funeral, he'd been glad, and he was glad now, that his grandfather had not lived to see him when he came back from Asia. No amount of staying on the mountain and bringing rocks home and sweating in the sweat lodge would have helped. He'd read books, educated himself, hoping to discover that the men in control were smarter, more able. Instead, he discovered that they were not especially able at all. They were merely bent. Ambition or fanaticism had turned them into men who were capable of anything. They didn't waste time shooting chipmunks. They saw to it that men like him killed every living thing in the forest. The street without joy didn't begin on Highway 1 in Vietnam. It began when the United States allowed the British to rearm the Imperial Japanese Army so that the French would have time to ship fresh troops to their colony in Indochina. America, land of the free and home of the brave, his country and his father's country and his grandfather's country, rearming the people who were responsible for Pearl Harbor so that the French could have their colony back. But as much as he hated those men, he loved this place, Montana. He'd stayed in Asia and done what he had done because he knew by then that he was lost anyway. That he hadn't died was something that made no sense whatsoever. He'd come home to his grandfather's funeral, out of place and time. He didn't know how else to put it. So that's Ben Tales, in his own words. And a little more of Ben Tales. Let's see. This gets to what I was talking about. We worked on warriors a little bit. When he was 17 years old, he had been a warrior. 30 years old, he'd still been a warrior. And now here he was. Here he fucking was. Middle-aged and lying on the floor in an empty apartment in Japan. He shut his eyes. 17 years old. No bamboo then, not even a hint. 17 years old and standing inside a stand of spruce. Asia still a year and a half away. A big doe bounding and plowing through snow up the slope toward him. Slowing to a walk. Wheezing through bushes 20 yards below, tongue hanging out the side of her mouth. At the bottom of the slope, other deer ran, white and gray haunches bouncing and flashing through bushes and between trees. Chest heaving, leg and haunch muscles trembling, the doe stopped, white showing around her eyes, and leaped silently away as farther down the ridge, 3 dogs spread in a line, came panting and grinning, bounding through the snow toward her. He'd raised his rifle and shot 2 of them. He hadn't even thought about it. He just shot them. Bam! Cycled a bolt. Bam! A pure moment, if ever there was a pure moment. The rounds hitting like they'd come out of his mind. The 3rd dog he tracked to a meandering line of dog prints leading down an old logging road. The only tracks in the unblemished snow. 2 switchbacks below, maybe 100 yards in a straight line. A big yellow Labrador cross of some kind plodded head down through the snow in the center of the road. Someone had probably dumped it on the edge of the woods the spring before. Not enough guts to kill it themselves, too rednecked or otherwise stupid to take it to the pound. And it had survived and grown not into some kid's dog, but into a killer that killed deer for the sheer fun of killing. A killer that could kill a rabid skunk or rodent and become rabid itself. He'd taken his time, sat down against a stump, legs crossed in what he'd later learn was a modified version of the sitting position. Left elbow resting on left shin, right elbow solid into the bend of the right knee, and shot it behind the head. The big yellow dog slammed face down, legs sprawled comically to the sides, like a cartoon dog run over by a truck. The sound of the shot fading across mountains gone silent. He'd watched as a gray skiff of snow moved diagonally across the little valley. The trees and bushes on the opposing slope black and harsh against the snow and the cold. And in that moment, a moment as lonely as he would ever again be in his life, he'd learned that a life, any life, so taken, carries a judgment. The trees and the mountains and the leaden sky had looked upon his actions, and their judgment had been harsh. The first 2 killings were one thing, they'd said. It was the third by which he had been judged. A big yellow Labrador cross of some kind plodding head down along a snow-covered logging road. And now, years later, it was Carlos, big, amiable Carlos with a grin that nobody could resist. Carlos as alone on a gray street in Japan as that big yellow dog had been in the middle of a snow-covered logging road in Montana. This time, it felt like maybe it was his turn to plod down that snow-covered road. So, that's Ben. Okay, so what happened to Ben to make him have these sorts of attitudes? This section sort of hints at what happened to him. I'm not going to read the whole section because it's maybe a little too violent for some of the people here. The countryside is littered with more bodies than some people might be willing to digest at the moment. But in this book, I somehow had to take Ben to the bottom of his being, the bottom of the barrel. I had to take him somewhere where he could not go any lower in the way he felt about himself and what had been done to him by his superiors, by Vietnam, by everything else. And this is part and parcel of that. Ben is on, this is about 1990, and Ben is on the Shinkansen, the bullet train in Japan. And he's remembering this particular scene. What I try to do is I try to work the scene to the point that it becomes the present in the mind of the reader, and not just a flashback, not just a memory. This is Ben experiencing it as he experienced it when it really happened. Geez, no wonder I'm having trouble reading. So he's on the Shinkansen looking out the window. Outside the window, beyond rice paddies and isolated hillocks of bamboo, rays of gray light filtered through the overcast onto blue mountains. He sighed. If he let it, the scenery always reminded him of another time, of other paddies and other mountains. He felt a rush of heat in his stomach, of Mr. Slide alone on a ridge. The Ville, until just a few minutes ago an idyllic picture of thatched huts and ramshackle sheds, was about 350 meters straight out across rice paddies green with ripening rice, and maybe 35 meters below where he had his hide inside a stand of bamboo. Even from where he was, he could hear the woman. An unending series of faint, high-pitched sounds, short, truncated, exhausted screams that reminded him of the sounds gut-shot deer sometimes make. A black, seriously ugly pig nosed around the edges of the common area, impervious to the sounds the woman was making. On the far side of the Ville was an old graveyard, the stones gray and moldy and leaning every which way, like the stones in an old Civil War graveyard he'd seen in North Carolina. A stream 10 or 12 feet wide meandered along one side of the village and out into the valley. Bushes and stands of bamboo and low, broad-leaved palms bordered the stream. Taller palms and larger trees, grapefruit and banana probably, grew in and around the Ville. Most of the valley floor consisted of rice paddies and villages. Veins of water bordered by thick foliage connected the villages. Some of the villages were bigger, some smaller, but nearly all were a copy of the one the sounds were coming from. Let me stop just for a minute and say that I never write my own stories. Ben Tales is not me. It's not me growing up in Montana. Ben Tales is a composite of real people. I learned a long time ago, I don't have to make anything up. Real stories are always way more exciting than anything I could ever dream up myself. What I do is I take real people, real stories, and make composites of them. In this particular case, Ben Tales is one of the best snipers to ever be in the Marine Corps. He's certainly perhaps the best in Vietnam. I was not a sniper. I was a crew chief on a helicopter. But I am a very good shot. I understand what it's like to shoot a sniper rifle. I use that little bit of knowledge that I have to understand the stories that are told to me by people who really were snipers. I was having a lot of trouble with this scene. This is a very key scene to the book because, as I said, it takes Ben down to the bottom of the barrel. And I had a couple friends who were some of the very best snipers in Vietnam. And they showed up at my house one day to help me with this scene. And they came back again and again. They really got into this scene. This scene grew in ways that I never imagined. It became a lot more horrible than anything I could have dreamed up myself. One day, one of them showed up with this, it's hard to see what it is, but it's a map that he drew. This is the valley out here, these are the finger ridges, the village, and so on. And this is what they came up from their collective memories of being snipers in Vietnam. So, when I read the rest of this is not something I really invented. These guys really helped me with this, otherwise I'm not sure I could have done it. So we've got Ben up on top of a ridge looking out over the valley at this ville where something terrible has happened. Keep forgetting that. Small gusts of wind swept haphazard across the paddies, bending rice shoots in scattered waves that seemed more a product of the sounds the woman was making than of wind. On the other side of the valley, the bombed-out ruins of the Catholic Church shone gray-white against green, jungled mountainside. The other side of the valley was Indian country, and no fucking doubt about that. Last night he watched as strings of lights, made hazy and diffused by moisture in the air and by the lenses on Chinese-made flashlights and lanterns, moved erratically across far foothills. Groups of NVA moving secure in the knowledge that the monsoon had grounded American air. Platoon-sized contingents of U.S. Marines spotted on easily defended high points. Rock outcroppings, for the most part, controlled the side of the valley he was on. The village below him was well out of range of Marine mortars and out of sight, thanks to the finger ridge he was on, of any Marine strong point. The ridge stuck out half a mile into the valley, a peninsula in a sea of green rice and yellow grass. At night, the NVA went where they pleased, but during the day, squad-sized Marine patrols would traverse the foothills and valley edges, checking out the villages that dotted this side of the valley floor, looking for any excuse to call in air or artillery. It had taken him 2 days to walk in. Last night, an hour before the evening monsoon, he'd set up in a grove of bamboo at the top of the ridge, and wrapped in his poncho sat out the mosquitoes in the rain, sleeping a few minutes at a time as sheets of rain and wind swept through the bamboo. An hour before first light, he'd gone into his routine, a routine he never varied. Broke down his weapon, used the silicone embedded cloth he'd purchased at a sporting goods store in Okinawa to wipe the surfaces, ran a clean patch down the bore, reassembled the weapon, removed and wiped the rounds and reloaded the 8 magazines the black major had made him bring, ate some rice and nookmom. He was actually starting to like nookmom. Had a drink of water, took out the old faded yellow plastic tobacco pouch his grandfather had used, and poured a spoonful or so of black sandbag ash into his hand. Added a little water, mixed the ash into a paste and applied it in streaks and smudges to his face and arms and hands, the back of his neck. Stowed his gear, making sure it was tight and quiet. And then, his routine finished, he'd moved out of the bamboo, down around the military crest, into a heavier, taller stand of bamboo. A wide cut and a waist-high ridge of rock just outside the bamboo gave him a field of fire that covered all approaches to the ville, and at the same time allowed him to keep the flash suppressor well back inside the cut so that the muzzle flash would be well hidden from anyone down in the valley. The hill fell away steep on the other side of the rocks. There was no tall grass in front of the rocks to stop him from using the prone position. He taped a thick piece of C-rack cardboard across the top of the lenses on his binoculars so that the morning sun could not reflect off the lenses, and then he'd waited. He was used to waiting. Most of the time in the bush was spent waiting. Just him and the mosquitoes and the ants and whatever creepy crawly happened along. Mosquitoes didn't like him much. Too much rebo something in his liver, according to the doc, so he didn't bother with bug juice. But ants were not nearly so choosy, and he'd sat until just before sunrise putting up with the ants, wiping them from face and neck and hands. Leeches were nasty. Snakes were an adrenaline rush nearly as bad as an ambush. And there were legions of yet-to-be-discovered bugs and spiders that could fuck you up, make you sick, even dead. But it was the ants that he hated. No matter where you were, no matter where you stopped, the ants always found you. Black, red, brown, big ants, little ants, VC ants, every one of them. Some with mandibles you could see, all of them mean as hell. The morning sky had cleared and the morning sky had been clear and blue and bright, sunlight hitting a mass of giant white cumulus clouds beyond the mountain on the other side of the valley. Ground fog had crept from the forest below, spreading into fields of grass and rice, turning the air under the bamboo heavy and wet and cold, clogged with the smell of decay, the forever rot and regeneration of forest, the evil sewer smell of Pattian village. He'd felt them before he had seen or heard or smelled them, a sense that something lethal was near. Shadow figures seen and then not seen through the leaves and branches of the bamboo. Woodland issue camouflage, face paint, bush hats, 20 meters to his left, exactly where he would have crossed the ridge if he had been leading the squad. Intervals of about 15 meters. No tinks, no rattles, no coughs, lean, mean Marines. His people, only the alien swipe of a cloth against leaf and grass to mark their passage, the soft knacking sound of bamboo and grass coming straight again. 12 in all, one man short if he hadn't missed one. 45 minutes later they had reappeared below, easing out of the forest, waist deep in ground fog and grass, their interval lengthened to 25 meters, a single staggered file headed toward the village. He'd recounted, 12 men, a squad leader and 3 fire teams, one team a man short, exactly as the black major had said it would be. One radio, one blooper, no 60, shotgun at point, shotgun at rear, M16 slung across the ruck of the rear shotgun. Through the binoculars he could see they were heavy on ammo and grenades, light on everything else. M16 magazines taped together. 2 men with ass packs, lean rucks on the rest. The RTO carrying the radio, a PRC-25 in his ruck. The 3-foot antenna pulled down over his shoulder and taped or tied to his doggy strap. 4 bandoliers on the blooper man, way more than usual. Probably 3 flechette rounds and 3 HE rounds in each blooper bandolier. buckshot and flechette rounds for the shotguns, 20 1-inch long thin metal darts the size of finishing nails to each shotgun flechette round. Each man carried an incendiary grenade in addition to the usual HE. The RTO and the squad leader carried smoke. The UCMJ does not and never has worked in these cases, the general had explained. The Uniform Code of Military Justice might work for a peacetime military, but it for damn sure does not work in combat-related situations. He paused and glared at Ben. And I'll be goddamned if there's going to be a Marine Corps version of My Lai on my watch. Do you understand me, Sergeant? Yes, sir. What else could he say? How else do you reply to a general? Especially one lean and starched and pissed off, ribbons up the wazoo. In the distant ville, the woman was finally silent. Combat-related situations. Roger that, General, sir. In any other war, if Marines had done what these people have been doing, they would have been shot out of hand. The general's black major, no ribbons, but clearly bad news, had added. Marine lawyers are calling it the mere gook rule. Those convicted of atrocities earn at most 4 years in the brig. Do you think that is right, Sergeant? The general asked. No, sir. Have a seat, Sergeant, the black major said. He'd been at parade rest, but instead of taking a seat, he'd come to attention, eyes on the fake wood paneling on the far side of the general's trailer. Sir, the sergeant is a Marine, sir. He felt the general's eyes on him. What the hell do you mean by that, Sergeant? My mission is to kill the enemy, sir. Go on. Sir, I use my skills to protect Marines, sir. No one is ordering you to shoot Marines, the black major said. Ben lowered his eyes, staring directly into those of the major. The major was maybe 10 years older, skin so dark it gleamed, the pupil of his eyes darker even than his skin. Aquiline nose, small, close to the head ears, boot haircut, small, cruel mouth. Bad news, no doubt about it. This major later becomes a major character in the books. Your orders are to go alone into the bush, the major said, to be at a place later to be named, at a time later to be determined. Your orders are to observe. The Marines in question will have opportunity to be where they should not be. If they do not show up in a reasonable amount of time, say within 3 days of your arrival at the place to be named, you are ordered to extract yourself. Yes, sir. The black major stared at him. Ben couldn't read his eyes, but there was something there. You are further ordered to use your discretion in deciding a remedy appropriate to the action of the Marines in question. Do you understand? Yes, sir. You are one of the best we have, Sergeant, the general said. There is no paper on this, and there will be none. Whatever your decision and subsequent actions, all this is between you and the major and myself. No one else. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Their sleeves will be rolled down to hide scars and or tattoos, the major had later told him. And through the binoculars he could see that despite the heat, their sleeves were indeed rolled down. Big, hairy, red-faced Americans all look alike to the Vietnamese, especially to those who live in villages, but scars and tattoos are easy to remember, the major had told him. The mere gook rule. He thought of his grandmother's ancestors as he watched through the binoculars 4 Marines move rapidly ahead of the file, slogging and splashing through paddy water and muck to the side of the ville. 2 men to the snaggletooth graveyard at the rear. Another man hurried to the right front of the ville, to the edge of the stream. Security against anyone leaving or entering from the side that bordered the stream. The rest of the squad paused, checking the ville out, and then quickly entered the now deserted village, slipping between hooches and sheds. He knew for sure that this was not the ville the OP had tasked them to visit. The ville they were supposed to inspect was to his right, a couple of clicks out in the valley on the other side of the ridge, at least 5 or 6 clicks from the village they were in. Two figures, a bareheaded old man wearing black pajamas and a middle-aged woman, conical straw hat, white blouse tight at the waist, baggy black pajama bottoms, had come out of a hooch and walked to the center of the common area. Two Marines, the squad leader and one of the shotguns, weapons pointed at the old man and the woman, had walked across the open area toward them. And from maybe a meter away, and probably without saying a word, the squad leader had fired a short burst from his M16 into the woman's stomach. Even before the M16 had fired, he'd felt bile rise, burn his chest and throat. Skipping ahead. He took his eyes away from the binoculars. To his right, way down at the far end of the valley, a black, impenetrable wall, the afternoon monsoon was slowly advancing toward him. Sick had seeped into his muscles, and in his mind he'd seen three dogs spread in a line, grinning as they ran, bounding through powder snow toward a wide-eyed, exhausted doe. The bright technicolor greens of forest, the blue sky, and clean white clouds had faded to pastels. And in that moment, a moment that completed the metamorphosis begun when he executed that big yellow dog plodding down a snow-covered logging road, he'd felt the anger that would forever be a part of him. Anger at whoever or whatever had put him there in that place at that time. And under the anger, warping it, a sense of loss as black and as consuming as the monsoon coming toward him on the horizon. The village was just another dirt-poor village in Vietnam. The valley was dotted with villages exactly like it. For all he'd known, the entire fucking continent was filled with villages like it. But through some grotesque whim of place and time, evil had visited that particular village at that particular time and had done so in the guise of a squad of Marines. Young men who, until only a short time ago, were as like him as the villages in the valley below were like each other. Evil had visited that village, and in doing so had visited him, leaving him with no choice, except one that in some form and to some degree required him to exercise more evil in order to do good. The general and the black major had foreseen this, had counted on it. This was what he had seen in the major's eyes. He raised his binoculars. Skipping way ahead through the carnage. It mattered not that he'd understood those Marines, who they were and where they'd come from and how they'd come to be what they were when they entered that village. To lie there and watch them completely destroy that village, to watch them kill everyone and everything in it, men, women, children, old, young, pigs, chickens, to watch them kill every living thing for gold and silver, and to assuage that black thing in their guts and in their minds, to lie there and watch all that and do nothing would have condemned him right along with them. His anger had been directed not so much at the Marines he was watching as it had been directed at his country and his people and his God for putting him and them in that place at that time. His anger had been a function of the certain knowledge that the instant he squeezed off that first round, there would be no return, no way back to who and what he'd been up to that moment. What he had not realized until it was all over and he was standing inside the forest was that he had placed himself not only outside the society he'd been born to, but also outside the society of warriors to which he felt he belonged. Among his grandmother's ancestors, the dogs had been respected. Loners out of necessity more than choice. Accomplished warriors willing to sacrifice themselves if the situation demanded, so that the tribe could live on. Lonely men, no doubt, who lived always with that bittersweet clarity known only to warriors. The sour taste of fear, the stink of death, always at the edge of their consciousness. Not an easy existence, but at least the dogs had had themselves, the camaraderie and understanding of men like themselves. Until that Bill, he'd always seen himself akin to being a member of that small society of Plains warriors. Afterwards, he knew that he had made himself an outcast even among them. He sighed, watching the Japanese countryside go by. As much as possible, he spent his remaining time in the bush. He was never alone in the bush. In the bush, he was part of the food chain. Whatever genetic connection he had to Blackfeet or French or German or Mongol warriors, a childhood spent in the mountains of Montana and then in the mountains of Southeast Asia had nurtured that genetic connection, made him into Mr. Slide, a man at home only in the bush. He hadn't realized it at the time, but watching that Marine shoot the woman in the stomach, he'd begun shedding skins, a process that had been complete by the time he crawled away from his hide. On the other side of the ridge, moving through forest and ground fog, he had morphed into a new, more attuned, even deadlier version of what he had been before. It had been a dark coalescence of fates, his and theirs, the villagers and the Marines and the NVA, that's all. Just as the dogs he'd shot might have grown to be grown to be good-natured pets had they not been abandoned to die or to fend for themselves, so too might the members of that squad have grown to be reasonable and productive members of society, had they not been placed in circumstances that had turned them feral. It had been his personal fate then, and it was his fate now, to be at the conjunction of those who had turned feral and those whom the feral preyed upon. The wheel had started with those dogs, and it was a wheel he couldn't seem to get off, no matter where he went or what he did. Back to the end. So, most of the book has been coming to some kind of understanding of self and learning to live with himself. And along the way, there's a love interest in a Japanese woman and so on. And lots of excitement, lots more gunfire, and so on. And the book comes back to Montana, where the final ambush takes place. And this is after that. Everything is basically over. And thinking of the 7 or 8 mile walkout, he sighed, abruptly footsore and tired. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, and as he did, heard the unmistakable throb of rotor blades, a large helicopter to the west, and the sound of rotor blades echoing between mountains and the sunset, and perhaps his fatigue combined to trigger a montage of memories, seen but not seen. Phantom images sifting through the red light, memory that made little sense. A black and green-faced Peter, teeth gleaming white beneath green foliage. Bodies and pieces of bodies, Marines and NVA alike, stretched out in the red dust and clay. Bodies jiggling on a helicopter floor. Bodies of NVA hung on trees and fences as warning around a Hmong village. An old man grinning toothless around a bowl of rice. A Hmong man and his wife dressed in traditional clothes, trudging along a busy road in Missoula, Montana, their faces almost comical in their bewilderment and fear. And unknown to him, tears, the first tears of his adult life, spilled from his eyes as images marched phantom-like through the red light, faces and places shuffling past, fading away as the wind changed direction, and he could see the first stars brittle in the night sky to the east. Other mountains, other places. Evie, I'm sorry, he thought, I really am. But how do you suppose we, men like me and Manfred and Robert Lee, got this way? Our childhood washed by monsoons that wept gray adrenaline. Our sanity too many times caught between reason and panic. Children we were, growing old to escape the stench of graves, knowing even then that our sacrifices were for naught. Don't mean nothing, we used to say. But standing here on this mountain, under a sky turning from blood red to night, smelling mountain and elk, at times like this, Edie, I am inexplicably made whole again. The double beep of a car or truck horn echoed up the ridge. Manfred and Robert Lee and maybe Jim on the road below, he thought. He wouldn't have to walk all the way home after all. He turned one last time toward the sunset and spread his arms wide, a puny, corny gesture that nevertheless felt good. Be honest with yourself, Ben Tails, he thought. You have eaten well, your dreams edible, nourishment enough for someone like you. That's it. So that's a thread that has to do with Vietnam. And as I said, I mean for Ben and what happens to Ben to be representative of what happened to America and Americans in Vietnam. To be reduced to shooting fellow Marines is about as bad as it gets. This was just an idea I had when I first started putting this book together. But those snipers were so into it. And they were so into it in ways and in details that it made me think, you know, in some way or in some form, this really happened. And indeed, researching it, in the old days, pre-Vietnam War, before the Uniform Code of Military Justice took over the military legal system, that was how Marines pretty much handled people who kind of strayed off the reservation. They keel-hauled them if they were on board a ship, or just threw them into the ocean. Or they somehow got shot in the course of whatever was happening. So this was just an extension of that. A Murder of Wolves, like I said, is a generational leap to the present, to the kind of military we have today, to what happens to veterans of our most recent wars. And it is considerably different than what happened to Ben Tails. So, any questions?
The door slammed and I didn't hear. So, generational, the next one is from Ben?
Ben Tails is the uncle of one of the main protagonists, who is a veteran. He was a Marine Force Recon veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. His name is Joe Big Snake Person. He's half Blackfeet, and he doesn't like being half Blackfeet. He's got issues with calling himself an Indian, and that's a whole thread that goes through it, all about Native Americans. But so far, I haven't heard anything from any tribal people on any of the reservations, and I know they've read it. So I think that's a really good sign that I might be on the right track, because they're not reticent to let you know when they don't agree with it.
It was so funny to me what you said about the Nook Mom, because my brother is a Vietnam vet. And when he came home from Vietnam, that was the main thing that he talked about was Nook Mom, and he brought a bottle of it. And it was so disgusting. I couldn't believe that anybody could eat it. And then fast forward 20 years, and my brother-in-law is married to a woman from Thailand. And they have that in their house, and that's what we're cooking fried chicken with. And it was just this weird little connection that you could use something that stinks so bad, make fried chicken from it, and it would taste so good. But it was like, just the fact that you mentioned the Nook Mom, that was the main thing that my brother brought home from Vietnam, was how that was everywhere. That was the main theme for him, and he wasn't in combat. He was actually working the warehouses and stuff. He was career Army.
Well, that's really
But
unusual.
Nook Mom was just that, he had to bring a bottle home because describing it in his letters was not enough to let us know how disgusting it was, but how ubiquitous it was.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
What is it?
Fish sauce.
That's a fermented fish sauce. You basically bury it for...
It stinks horribly, but if you dip it in, my sister-in-law from Thailand showed us, you dip it, fried chicken, you dip chicken in that, and then deep fat fry it. Your hands will stink like fish, but the chicken tastes really good. It's weird.
Well, the whole idea for Ben is to be out in the bush and not smell like an American.
And that gets you there, because it's disgusting.
If he ate hamburgers and beef, he'd smell like an American. And I kind of poo-pooed that most of my life. But when I came back from Asia, two things really struck me. Was the way people smelled, and it was definitely different. I don't mean it was bad or anything. It was way different. But the biggest thing, after being, to me, the Vietnam War is not just Vietnam. It's Laos, Cambodia, parts of Thailand, parts of Burma, even parts of southern China. I mean, this is something that was just, it was huge. What struck me when I first came back, this is after the Marines in Vietnam, and I'd been running around Southeast Asia like a total idiot. And what struck me was there were no maimed people on the street or in the restaurants. There were no one-legged or no-legged or one-armed or beautiful women with just horribly disfiguring scars on their faces and things like that. There was none of that here. It was really weird. Everybody looked, they were all in one piece, and that didn't seem natural. And the other thing was, I could suddenly understand everything everybody was saying. Instead of straining to understand some of the language going on around me, it was just, all this information just walking through the airport was just flooding into my mind, because I'd forgotten how to just tune out most of what goes on in daily life here. And I was hearing everything everybody was saying. It's not a pleasant experience. You really don't want to know most of what people are talking about. So those were the two big things.
Well, this concept of going after your own with the Marine, did it kind of grow out of the fragging? I mean, that was a big deal in Vietnam, and I don't know how much of it actually happened, but where things get unreasonable enough that you take out your own commander or something.
I had this idea. I wanted, like I said, I had to get Ben down to the bottom of the barrel. And there could be nothing worse for a warrior of his stripe to have to turn on the very people that he's been protecting. But the general and the black major put him into a situation where he really had no choice. I mean, it was... So I researched atrocities in Vietnam, Marine Corps atrocities. And then at that time, there'd been quite a bit written about guys had been caught for doing some kind of atrocity, and not getting any kind of sentence at all. I mean, being put in the brig and busted to private kind of thing for a month or something like that, for shooting like 5 or 6 villagers. Like that Army sergeant that went out in Afghanistan or wherever it was and killed 12 people. Things like that were happening in Vietnam, and nobody was getting more than a slap on the wrist for it. And I thought, man, how far we've come to be letting some of our men get by from the Marine Corps. I mean, this is not the Americal division and My Lai. This is not one of the worst divisions in the Army. This is the Marine Corps. This is the best of the best. And there's atrocities being committed by Marines. Well, what does that say about the war in Vietnam? Right there. So it grew out of that. And that phrase, the Mere Gook rule, that was a rule that was set by Marine Corps defense lawyers. I mean, that's what they use. You know, they go have drinks at the officers club and they talk about the Mere Gook rule. If you shot a fellow American, you went to jail for the rest of your life. If you shot a handful of gooks, hey, they're all going to die anyway. You know, that kind of thing. So, you know, and that's all representative of us as a country and the way we fought the Vietnam War. Well, when your only strategy in a war, I mean, basically our administration, the Johnson administration, the Nixon administration, nobody had a strategy. The only strategy was to kill so many of them they would give up and let us do what we wanted to do. By the end of the war, Giap had more men than ever in uniform. And he had total control of how many of those men died. I mean, it was a limitless supply fighting the war that we were fighting. It just wasn't going to happen. So it all grew out of that kind of thing. I mean, how can you not have atrocities when the only strategy you're offering your fighting men is just go kill as many of them as you can? Body counts are going to get inflated. Collateral damage is just going to be through the roof. And indeed it was. So, any more questions?
Good reading.
Thanks. Thanks for coming. I'm glad somebody came. I was kind of worried.